Okay, and it is recorded.
Excellent.
Oh, so should I start letting everybody join as well?
Let everyone know.
I'll admit all, yeah.
Hey, welcome everyone to Shifting Spaces, Understanding the Impacts of AVs and Land Use. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to get in here right after lunch, and we'll get started in just a few minutes.
Robert, can you make it so that we don't longer need to allow people in? They can get in automatically?
I'm not sure how to change that now that we're in, but I'll see if I can.
Okay. Either that or one of us needs to keep an eye on the...
I'll let Anne take those reins when she's done. Yeah.
I can do it. I can do it.
Okay.
Okay, we'll give everyone about 1 more minute.
And you just stop sharing. Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for a few more people to come in, and then we're going to start up.
Give me 1 sec. We're going to start about 1:04. Okay, sorry everyone for the delay as we wait for people to join. Welcome to the Urbanism Next webinar on shifting spaces, understanding the impacts of AVs and land use. We have a great panel here for you today. So we're going to kick off with, for any new faces, a quick overview of Urbanism Next. I'm Anne Brown. I'm the moderator of this webinar. I'm the research director for the Urbanism Next Center. And Urbanism Next, we are a research center based at the University of Oregon, and we study different technologies in cities and different types of transportation technologies, new mobility, mobility as a service, autonomous vehicles, e-commerce, and more. And our research focuses on really understanding those disruptions and then the impact those can have on a whole variety of factors for communities and cities and how they shape the outcomes that cities really care about. We have a framework that if you haven't yet been introduced to, I would welcome you to check out on our website. This is really how we approach a lot of the research we work on to really understand those impacts and disruptions across sectors from land use, urban design, real estate, building design, and beyond. And then thinking about what they mean for cities in terms of equity, health and safety, environment, and economy. And then, of course, what we actually do about it. So this webinar fits really nicely within this framework. We're excited to share the research with you. But again, be in touch and I encourage you to check out more of our work in these intersectional spaces. I'm also going to make a really quick plug before we get into the meat of today's webinar. For our next upcoming webinar, which is in June, it's on shared mobility regulations and thinking about balancing policy goals with operating costs. So you can stay tuned on our website. The date is being finalized, but if you are signed up for Urbanism Next email listserv, then you will have that in your inbox before long. So please stay in touch, and we'll look forward to sharing that with you all next month. Now, for today, we're moving to talk about shifting spaces, understand the land use impacts of AVs. And we have three terrific presenters with us today. First, we have Marissa Laderack, who's a principal regional planner with the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG. Marissa is a principal regional planner in Partnerships, Technology, and Innovation Department at SCAG, and also the director of the Southern California Clean Cities Coalition. Marissa managed a number of smart city and clean technology programs within the department and supports SCAG's long-range planning efforts related to clean and connected technologies, smart city initiatives, electrification, and mobility strategies. Marissa is a certified planner and holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning. We also have Nico Larco, who's the director of the Urbanism Next Center and also a professor at the University of Oregon. Nico directs the sustainable urban design, has developed the sustainable urban design framework, and assists projects in how to best apply these principles and approaches in practice. And last but not least, Robert Binder is a senior researcher at Urbanism Next and researches topics related to transportation equity, justice, and public space theory. He holds a Master of City and Regional Planning from Georgia Tech and a PhD in urban planning from the University of Southern California. I'm going to turn this over to Nico to provide some framing conversations and comments. Then Robert will take it away to present some specific research findings from our latest report. And then Marissa is going to round us out with perspectives and experiences from SCAG.
All right. Can everyone see my screen? Excellent. Let me reduce my, okay. Excellent. Great. So thanks so much. Very excited to be here and to share this research. We were just talking about this before everyone came on, how exciting it was to do this research, and that we've used it in a bunch of different places. So this is research that Robert, myself, and Matthew Channing did through the Mobility Center of Excellence based in UCLA. And really the main, the main question really was, like, how is it that AVs are going to have impacts on land use? We've been working in the space a long time. We've had a lot of people who have a lot of ideas about how it could be impacting land use, and we wanted to really try to be more specific about that and really answer the questions of how much is really at play, how much land use is really at play in all this, and what parts of cities might be affected differently on this. To do this, we did first a literature review looking at different potential impacts, AV impacts on land use, thought through a lot of those things internally, and then did an analysis of the LA area, which Robert will be talking about. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the lit review that we did and some of the basic ideas that we kind of built this research off of. So in looking at the AV impacts on land use, we really looked at these four main categories, which seem to be throughout the literature the consistent ones on the types of impacts that could happen. Or auto-oriented land uses, this is things like gas stations and auto lots and those types of things that could be impacted, parking, sprawl, and then how it might affect density, both increasing and decreasing. So in terms of auto-oriented land uses, really the main ones that we're thinking of are things like auto malls, which dominate certain areas of cities, lots of services, which includes mechanics, auto parts stores, gas stations, those types of things. The idea is that with self-driving cars, many of these things will go away, especially if they're in the shared AV model, right? So the things such as Waymo, the way Waymo is working right now, or the idea of how shared mobility works, that there's cars that we all come pick us up, drop us off, and then go pick up somebody else. So we no longer need to own our own car. We wouldn't need to be fueling our cars. A lot of these cars are also electric, and we definitely wouldn't need to be servicing these cars because most of these cars are dealt with in fleets. Even if they're privately owned, the idea is that they are going to be sophisticated enough that we might not be doing as much work on them ourselves. So in the literature, the threatened land use is pretty much that: gas stations, repair shops, car dealerships, these types of things. Interestingly as well, there's the idea that there are some other types of audio-oriented land use that would change are the idea of depots or warehouses, where a new land use, which is where the AV companies, the transportation network companies might be storing their vehicles and maintaining them. So as a new land use would be seeing. But that, the changes to these land uses, we found there's a lot of research kind of showing that there's a lot of barriers to redevelopment of these spaces. Definitely with gas stations and mechanic shops, there's lots of questions about contamination of the soil, which would slow things down, and that just zoning changes are slow in actually being implemented. So in fact, through all of the research we were looking at, one of the things that kind of resonated continually was this idea that even though things could change and we might imagine them changing or how that would happen, the changes to both because of the political process and we'll say the regulatory process of zoning changes would slow. This is not going to happen tomorrow. Even if AVs were out everywhere tomorrow, we would not see these land use changes. They're going to lag, definitely. In terms of parking, lots of opportunities potentially for reduction in parking. The idea being that if you don't need to, cars typically 95% of the time are just sitting not used, and 5% of the time are circulating. As we shift to fleets, or even as we shift to privately owned AVs, we just need a whole lot less parking. The vehicles are not going to be, we don't need to store them near where we are, and we might not even own them as well. So there would need to be, that 5% of utilization rates might go way up, and we don't actually need to have them stored anywhere. They're going to be out being used by somebody else. The literature really is a range of, we found a range of findings. On the one hand, parking might be reduced by up to 95%. And on the other hand, it might increase by 4%, which is, you might say, is a pretty large range. So we did some digging in this project and also in a project we've done previously with Waymo on impacts of AVs on development and parking, on what are the factors that are really influencing the differences that we're seeing here. Because with a range that big, the underlying assumptions are really what's changing. And this actually turned out to be very interesting. The differences are, if we really take apart those different studies, are they talking about shared AVs or privately owned AVs? Are they talking about pooled rides or individual rides? The extent of market penetration, so in other words, what percentage of trips are being done by AVs versus legacy vehicles? The range of geographic deployment. Is this just AVs existing in the core of a city, dense areas where the origins or destinations are close to each other, or the entire metropolitan area, or even beyond that into exurban areas? What are the parking costs and how much transit richness exists? And generally, you see higher impacts to parking reduction, so more parking reduction when you have shared AVs that are using pooled rides, high market penetration, large geographic deployment, high parking costs, and high transit richness. So those conditions, from what the research looks at from different models look like, really would substantially reduce parking requirements, parking demand. That said, that might not be really the scenario that we're going to. As we look between shared AVs and privately owned AVs, I think we're still up in the air of what direction that's going to go. As you all know, Waymo and Tesla seem to be the two leaders in these different camps right now. Unclear what direction that's going to end up going in. In terms of pooled rides, it's not clear that pooled rides are something that people are interested in. Uber and Lyft have both tried that tremendously and has not worked out well. There's a lot of resistance to it. Market penetration, unclear what scale we're going to have deployment happening anytime soon. Geographic deployment, unclear both the scale of geographic deployment and hard to believe that the business models are and capital requirements are going to actually support having large metropolitan areas covered. The deployments that we have right now, and when we think about Waymo's deployments, are all very much in the core areas of the cities that they're in. And then, high parking costs and high transit richness, that does not happen everywhere. So I'll just say that there's definitely a publication bias towards scenario that show the most impacts. I'm not exactly convinced that those are the impacts that we're going to be seeing. Those are the scenarios that are most likely to be happening. And Robert's going to talk a little bit more about the impacts we saw that are based on parking. So keep this in mind as he talks about that. In terms of sprawl, the idea is, as you know, historically, anytime that we've made transportation easier, people have used it to go further out into the periphery. So, you know, with the advent of streetcar suburbs, we expanded out from our cores. With the advent of the car, we expanded out even further. AVs, in theories, should make it easier for us to travel. And so the question was, how will this impact sprawl? So if we can be productive in our commutes, or we can be relaxed, or you know, we can watch a movie, you know, a nap, actually be working, all these types of things, we might actually be willing to accept longer commutes. So that's kind of the basic idea behind this. Studies showed that with privately owned AVs, that's likely to create a lot of sprawl, right? 8 to 11% growth in the urban area from a couple of different studies. At the same time, shared AVs might have the opposite impact, because with shared AVs, the proximity of origins and destinations are what really make the model work better. And so there might be incentives for people to be closer in, to reduce their wait times, and to have lower prices for their trips. So studies show like approximately a negative 4% urban area growth. But as I mentioned before, zoning, the cost of these services, and infrastructure needs could contain sprawl or constrain sprawl. So even if we see, again, if the vehicles were out here tomorrow, this is not going to be an immediate type of effect. Density, very related to the sprawl kind of question is, will this cause less density overall, or will there be incentives for more density because you know, we no longer have to put parking, for instance, on lots, and lots that were used for parking can now have more construction happening on them, right? So it could increase the overall urban density. Studies showed pretty much that SAVs could support densification, again, improving access, reducing the need to provide parking, and shifting land that's currently used for parking, right? That land use can actually be changed to more productive uses, actually with construction on them. So from 4 to 104% increase in density in the central business districts, some of the studies showed. But privately owned AVs could actually reduce densification because they encourage dispersion, very much related to the sprawl piece. So -1 to -3% density, rates of density in urban areas. Interesting kind of piece of this is that commercial land uses typically follow residential shifts. So as you see shifts in housing, that's when, you know, you see densification happen. That's when you see more commercial services coming into an area. So whatever impacts we end up seeing based on the research that we looked at above, those are probably going to be amplified on the commercial side. And again, but this will be limited by zoning, lifestyle preferences. Not everyone, just because people can move to the suburbs doesn't mean that people will move to the suburbs, right? It depends a whole lot on demographics, lifestyle choices, those types of things. Yeah. So basically, the literature on these pieces, you know, auto-oriented land uses and parking. Auto-oriented land uses, you see the biggest kind of potential change. Parking, a whole range of changes, which really depend on what deployment scenarios we end up having, and what conditions exist there. And you know, the research that gets a lot of headlines tends to, in my view, overemphasize the larger reductions in parking. With sprawl and density, big shifts between PAVs and SAVs, privately owned AVs versus shared AVs, but generally privately owned, more sprawl, less density. Shared AVs, less sprawl, increased density. Yeah, and with that, I will pass it on to Robert to talk about more about our analysis.
Awesome. You can see the slides?
Yeah, they look great.
Awesome. Yeah, I want to echo, first of all, Nico's sentiment that this was a really fun project to do, and I'm excited to share our results with you. So based on what you've heard from Nico, hopefully you can see that much of the AV and land use literature has remained pretty conceptual. I mean, naturally, we don't have many AVs out on the road yet. We see a lot of broad claims about transformation, but far fewer studies have examined what those changes would look like. So a major gap is the connection between these large-scale projections and parcel-level redevelopment realities. And then there's also an important distinction. It's between theoretical change and the allowable or likely change. And so just because a land use could change an AV feature, it doesn't mean that zoning, parcel characteristics, ownership patterns, or market conditions are going to support that transition. So for example, removing parking demand does not automatically mean every parking lot becomes housing or every gas station becomes mixed-use development. The redevelopment potential varies depending on the context. So our main research question based on what we saw as missing is where and how much of our built environment is truly in play in an autonomous and shared mobility future. So by in play, we mean land that could realistically experience these redevelopment pressures or functional change as travel behavior, parking demand, and vehicle ownership patterns evolve. So importantly, we're not assuming that AVs automatically transform cities. Much of this is dependent on the deployment model, as Nico mentioned. And rather, we wanted to identify which parcels and land use types appear most susceptible to change, and then those that are likely to remain stable. And this is what led us towards a parcel level spatial analysis focused on LA County. As most of us know, a region with a highly diverse range of land use patterns that, in our opinion, can also be representative of other large car-oriented, car-focused metropolitan areas across the US. So with our methodology, this involves identifying the in-play parcels. So what we did was we flagged parcels likely to transition using OpenStreetMap. We narrowed these parcel types down to car-focused and to parking-dominated. Car-focused meaning, similar to what Nico mentioned, gas stations, car washes, repair shops, car dealerships, these things that especially in these land uses that especially in a shared AV situation, we would likely see to turn over. With parking dominated, we used all parcels with 50% of the land area devoted to parking. We see that one could argue that this may be a little bit arbitrary, but we felt that it was a starting point that was conservative enough for the sake of this study. Hopefully others can mess around with the parking dominated as they continue to push this research. I will also note, as we get into the indicators, I'm going to show you indicators around parcel area, property values, and improvement values. I'm going to focus first on parcel area, or I'm going to show you parcel areas and property values. Generally, improvement values are going to follow very similar trends to the property values. I also think it's important to note that due to California's Proposition 13, there's a gap that often exists between a parcel's assessed value and its eventual sale price. So thus, the assessed property values in the data that we're using likely actually underestimates the actual market-based economic exposure of some of these parcels. And so there's some of the typologies that I'll talk to you about in a moment. So regionally speaking, we're only looking at 4% of all land area within LA County that we've identified as car-focused or parking-dominated. So, we see these renderings, we see these now AI-generated images of like this autonomous vehicle future, and that shows a lot of change. And what we're actually seeing is this change is very likely much smaller and dependent on a lot of different factors. Within that 4%, 95% of it is parking related. So unless we do see these huge changes with the way that parking is used and the way that parking lots are used for our vehicles, and whether it be a shared fleet deployment model or whether it be private ownership like we have now, 95% of that 4% is dependent on those big factors. The other thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to look at more specific land use typologies. And so we selected these typologies based on 3 criteria. So the first was urban form diversity. We wanted to represent a broad range of built environments, from dense downtown conditions to lower density residential areas, corridors, industrial logistics spaces. Second was relevance to other US cities. We obviously would love for this to be replicated in other ways. So while we ground this in Los Angeles, the categories themselves are intentionally transferable. And these development patterns and land use conditions we see appearing across many metropolitan metropolitan regions. And then third is AV-related land use salience. So we focused on places where autonomous vehicle activity was likely to produce these observable spatial effects. Things like the parking conversion, demand for parking conversion, depot activity like Waymo, where Waymo is locating, curb reorganization, and things like that. To focus on a few of them, the downtown typology, this is dense, mixed use, employment core, this is specifically downtown LA. There, we see an interaction between the highest value land and these car serving uses, but there are not a lot of car focused uses. And so the downtown typology is really dependent on parking turning over into new development and new uses. The next one is high mid-density multifamily home. If you're familiar with LA, Koreatown is where we did this, where we use this typology. And Koreatown is the densest neighborhood in all of LA, and I believe in LA County. And so with this is a very apartment and condo dominated area. And there's a tension between this density and excess parking. Most of these apartment and condos have these massive parking decks underneath or attached to them. And then on-street parking is always a battle in this area. Given that I've lived in this neighborhood, I can tell you that. The next one is auto mall. And so this kind of tells you exactly what it is. It's dominated by auto dealerships and other car focused businesses like repair shops. And change here would be dependent on the deployment model specifically. So are we going to see fleets or continued personal ownership? And even then, is there going to be the demand, the capital, the environmental cleanup necessary for this sort of corridors redevelopment? And so we observe similar aspects like this with the other typologies that are dominated by parking orientation, so malls and business parks. And then finally, the Waymo, the main depot, but also the other Waymo depot, we're seeing that fleet service centers are being located in activity centers with higher demand for TNC service. These locations are clearly not based on cheap land. It's about being close to the customer and the consumer. In order to compare these typologies, we did a cross-typology comparison. So this first slide is looking at parcel areas. We divided them up into urban centers, residential areas, commercial employment areas, and then Waymo depots. For the urban centers, this is downtown and town center. Town center was, we noted Santa Monica as that town center, but there are several others around the region that you could see the same sort of thing happening in. The urban centers show a moderate AV impact, so about 18 to 21% of land is tied to parking or car uses. The residential areas, from multifamily home to single family homes, this is the lower impact overall, mostly from excess surface parking in low density neighborhoods. So in these areas, you see these corner-based strip malls. Those are the surface parking domination. But other than that, within the residential neighborhoods themselves, this would be more dependent on like very, very minor changes in how people use their driveway and on-street parking and things like that. Commercial and employment areas, these are the large parking lots, the malls, the car-focused sites that dominate. These typologies show the highest impact naturally, 25 to 48%. And then we see the Waymo depot areas, as I mentioned, looking much like the urban centers, aligning with the observation and locating close to that customer demand. Similarly, you see similar trends in the property values, and this is no surprise either. Urban centers, moderate AV impacted property values as well, mostly from the car dominated parcels. As I mentioned, car focused uses are more minimal. The residential areas are the low impact, 5 to 16%. This makes sense given the value of land in these less dense areas, with most value tied to surface parking. And then the commercial and employment areas are the highest, again, AV related property values, and it's up to 67% of an impact. Oops, sorry. Another way that we did these comparisons is we wanted to see how these typologies aligned with the regional baseline. The baseline is the one that I showed earlier, which is the 4% of land changing over. And so when considering parcel area, we wanted to see like, okay, are these typologies conservative, taking a conservative look at this, or are these typologies kind of a misnomer based on what we might see regionally? So when considering parcel area, we see that commercial employment areas like malls and business parks stand out with the largest positive divergence. So meaning there is more change likely to occur than compared to the region. In contrast, residential areas, they fall below the baseline, confirming that these AV impacted land is concentrated in a few specific contexts rather than evenly across the region. For property values, the pattern's similar. Commercial employment areas, especially business parks and malls, show the highest above baseline property values tied to parking. Meaning that while the overall footprint of AV impacted land is limited, the economic stakes are concentrated in a few high value contexts. So based on all that, some key takeaways. Despite these widespread claims that autonomous vehicles will radically reshape cities, our findings suggest that these impacts will be incremental and highly localized, so not transformative at a regional scale. The pace and the extent of the change will depend less on technology itself than on zoning, market forces, and the geography of existing urban form, and the ways that we decide as planners, as policymakers, to make those changes within within zoning things and land use. And yeah, the scale of change, uneven geographies, economic and policy implications, these are the key takeaways of our research. And so to finish up, I want to note that a link to the report has been dropped in the chat, I believe. And if you're interested in learning more, and I really appreciate your time and letting me present this work to you. So now I'm going to pass it off to Marissa.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be following these presentations, really excited to be here talking with you all today. Pulling up my slides. Hopefully they all look okay. All right, so perfect, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Marissa Laterack here from SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments. Really excited to be here to talk a little bit about autonomous vehicles and land use in the SCAG region. All right, so the SCAG region. For those of you who just might not be super familiar, we do oversee the 6-county area of Southern California. This excludes San Diego, as you likely notice. And today we're really going to be focusing on Los Angeles. But of note, Los Angeles has half of the population. We've got over 18 million residents in SoCal in our region, and half of them are in Los Angeles County. So a very, very massive county with a lot of folks. And when it comes to planning and policies for AVs, we do all acknowledge that AVs have the potential to revolutionize transportation and help contribute to safety, accessibility, and other types of mobility goals. But I really want to emphasize that we do not yet fully know the rate at which AVs will penetrate the market. And because there's so much uncertainty still, the land use implications are going to be massive. And that's part of why studies like the Shifting Spaces Land Use and Zoning Report are so critical in helping us identify the models and the different potential impacts that we might see. Now, from a metropolitan planning organization perspective, a couple things that we look at when we think about deploying technologies like this. We want to make sure that we're weighing potential benefits against potential risks, that we are deploying AV systems that advance rather than hamper our regional goals, and additionally that we're treating AVs as a distinct vehicle technology that will require specific policy interventions. So speaking of policy interventions, as the Metropolitan Planning Organization in Southern California, we're responsible for a variety of planning. A lot of that's long-range planning, but I'd like to talk about some things that we've done recently, some things we have underway, and some things that are looking out further into the future. So first of all, recently we've completed our Emerging Technologies Guiding Principles framework. This is a 10-point guiding principle framework where practitioners, stakeholders, local agencies, and SCAG ourselves, we can evaluate any kind of emerging mobility technology against those 10 points to help understand if it's a good solution. And this includes everything from equity to data privacy and security, workforce development, transparency, accountability. These are all really critical for us, especially when we think about AV deployments. Now, additionally, something we're working on right now is our Smart City Strategic Plan. And along with this comes some opportunity zones. I'll talk about this because this is going to be one of our more helpful implementation strategies for looking at AV deployment in the region, but it also will help us identify the testing grounds where we can develop these best practices for local jurisdictions to manage the transition to AVs. And then additionally, we have Connect SoCal 2050. So a big thing that we do as an MPO, I'm sure many of you are familiar, is we're mandated to complete our regional transportation plan, our sustainable community strategy, or our RTP SES. We have to do this every 4 years. Right now, we're in the process of updating Connect SoCal 2024, our last plan. We're looking forward to Connect SoCal 2050. And of course, part of this is going to be thinking, what is coming for the region as far as AV infrastructure and just AV systems, generally speaking, as we go into 2050. And then even further, thinking about where there's this intersection of some of these policy areas with AVs, I would like to draw attention to a couple of things that are fresh and center in our mind. One of them is safety as a foundation. We know that AVs as a tool can potentially help us achieve our Vision Zero initiative, which is where we're looking to reduce or eliminate traffic collisions from human error. So that's a big component. We see safety as a part of AV systems. We also see vehicle to everything, V2X infrastructure to help us optimize traffic flow and make use of the infrastructure we already have. So there's some optimization there as well. And then again, back to these opportunity zones, this is a part of our implementation of looking to what AV can be in the region. And this is part of what we're accomplishing in our Smart City Strategic Plan, is doing that assessment, looking at current and planned AV implementation, and then helping to identify zones for future deployments. So that being said, I do want to take a moment to talk about our Smart City Strategic Plan process that's underway, because just this month we completed our existing conditions analysis, and this really helped us reveal 5 kind of major themes that are affecting AV deployment in SoCal. So this is really timely time for SCAG to be participating in this conversation as well. We've just learned some things about our region too. So as far as infrastructure goes, we know that AV readiness is currently defined and really experienced as this extension of intelligent transportation systems, or ITS, and as well as digital communication. So thinking fiber, 5G, V2X, things like that. And as mentioned in the Shifting Spaces findings, AV implementation is expected to be a little bit more targeted, a little bit more of a slower rollout. And that really aligns with what we're seeing in our region currently as well. So our existing conditions are confirming that's how it's going so far. Now, when it comes to deployments, our region is a great testing ground for a lot of regulatory programs. That includes everything from, the California DMV AV deployment program to private partners and operators in this area like Waymo that we're all familiar with at this point. So there's a lot of deployments happening in the SCAG region. We also know from a curb management perspective, AVs are highly sensitive to unregulated curb conditions, and that makes sense. If we don't have designated pickup and drop-off zones, we will see unsafe disruptions in the transportation around those curb spaces. So that's another important consideration. When we think about investments, we really need to look at this from a prioritization lens. So thinking about multi-criteria frameworks that can help us identify these high-impact opportunity zones, places where we see intersecting travel demand, safety, risks, digital readiness, all of that together, which really, again, helps to reinforce what we had found in the Shifting Spaces report here, that, these types of multi-criteria frameworks and these types of analyses are just so critical for helping us identify high impact areas. And when we look at it from the perspective of prioritizing dollars and investments, we really want to target those high impact areas. And then lastly, operational risks is another big one. And I think that this, still really factors into the land use side of things. As far as operational risks, we've got increasing VMT, decreasing human-centered mobility, increasing sprawl, all of this contributing to a potential kind of rebound effect that we'd really want to be mindful of at the regional level. So that being said, I'll take just a few minutes to talk about some of these land use implication examples. That rebound effect is certainly something we'd be mindful of. We already know that the easier we make transportation, the more convenient we make it, the more likely that that will increase vehicle miles traveled, and then that can induce more sprawl as well. So when we think about things like deadheading concerns, which is, vehicles driving with 0 passengers while waiting for fares to go and pick up another passenger, we know that that's an existing issue with just regular transportation systems and car sharing systems, generally speaking. So it makes sense that that would translate potentially into AV systems as well. And then thinking a bit more was we, have already discussed a little bit today, but thinking about those shared rides and shared rides versus private rides, really, to help mitigate the risk of sprawl. We do think that shared autonomous vehicles and those types of models will be more beneficial over private ones because they have the power to help encourage compact development patterns that would support transit and linkages with active transportation rather than single occupancy travel. And another one of these potential implications, thinking about the obsolescence of traditional auto-oriented land uses, there's going to be a really big social and community consequence to that kind of a shift if that's what we end up seeing. And we would be certainly interested in the social and fiscal consequences of the shift, noting certain potential community impacts. In Southern California, gas stations are often owned by immigrants and immigrant families, so we want to make sure nobody gets left behind in this transition to cleaner fleets. And additionally, we know that there will be, a pretty big fundamental shift in designing how we approach the built environment, especially when it comes to fueling infrastructure and things like that. We're already seeing this a lot in the transition to EV infrastructure, moving away from gas-powered vehicles into electric-powered vehicles. We're already going through this kind of a fundamental shift as well. So we anticipate we'll need to think about that for AVs as well. And then lastly, one other final thought here. We are a big fan of mobility hubs at SCAG. And one of the things we'd like to see ideally is that AVs they're not necessarily this kind of standalone mobility solution, but we'd like to see them integrated as a component of mobility hubs. Mobility hubs for us, physical locations where transit, shared vehicles, and active transportation all intersect. In the last time we did that 4-year transportation plan I was mentioning, Connect SoCal 2024, we identified over 700 potential mobility hub locations across the region. And these are areas where we really intend to see land use shifting away from traditional parking and more towards multimodal infrastructure foundation to help support seamless transfers between different modes of travel. And then this would offer us an opportunity to integrate AV infrastructure at these key locations. So that's another big kind of concept and goal of ours, is that AVs don't have to be these closed systems that operate in these isolated, standalone fashions, that they can be integrated with other innovative solutions too. So that's it for my presentation. I will pause my screen sharing. We can open it up for question and answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Marissa. And thanks to Robert and Nico as well. So I want to 2 housekeeping notes really quick. First, for everyone to take a look at the Q&A area on the webinar, please feel free to drop in any questions you have, and I'll then field those to our panelists. And then the other housekeeping note is in the chat, so slightly different than the Q&A. We've added a link to the report authored by both Robert and Nico that covers the findings Robert shared. So please check out that link. The report is live and posted on our website and has all the nitty-gritty details of those methods and findings. Okay, so I'm going to kick us off with a question, but again, everyone, please feel free to drop your own questions in the Q&A. So reflecting on what Nico, you framed these big pictures around possible implications for AVs. Robert, you started getting into the specific land use implications across different types of typologies. And then Marissa, you reflected and shared some of what SCAG is specifically working on. So my question for you all in this is really thinking about the roles of different levels of government in coming together to prepare for AVs and or realign land use policies with those goals. So thinking about the role of local cities, the counties, and then also MPOs, or metropolitan planning organizations like SCAG, for example. So curious what you all think, and then again, invitation to everyone else to add your questions to the Q&A.
Maybe I'll just start off by saying, as
I described in the literature review part, a lot of the implications of how AV's deployment is going to impact land use is in the type of deployment that's going to happen, right? And so I think the things that Marissa talked about are exactly aligned. Like, if as a state and I'll say, if as a city that is allowed and supported by the state, that is allowed and supported by the federal government, is able to have regulations that push towards deployments that make more sense for, I'd say, societal benefits that align well with the goals that our municipalities and cities, states, nation have, then that makes it's fantastic, right? So if you're doing things which are helping to create shared rides or pooled rides, or reducing empty vehicle miles traveled, or strong parking policies, all these things are going to help create the right types of impacts. I'd say impacts on the land use that are more aligned with the outcomes that we want. So yes, a lot of need for, so in terms of the land use piece, the land use itself, that is typically a local designation, and I think it's great for people to stay at the local level, for that to be a local designation or jurisdiction. But some of these policies, as Marissa was talking about, like absolutely the state and the feds need to be aligned with that, or else we're going to get deployment scenarios that have negative effects overall, including land use. Marissa or Robert, do you all want to? Yeah.
Yeah, so from our perspective as the Metropolitan Planning Organization in SoCal, our goal is always to convene folks together and to help drive the conversations, to make sure that all the key players are in the same room, and it's really important for us to empower local champions who have the authority to implement and install things at the local level, right? So from our perspective, regional governments, we're here to be a guide to help bring people together, to convene folks, have these conversations happen. Also, part of what we do is laying the foundational framework for policies, guiding policies, of course, that, are intended to be helpful resources for local implementers and partners. Not that, we want to be, the overarching authority on what kind of AV systems need to be developed, but our goal is to create policies that support and supplement whatever the local level implementers are doing. And from there, they're the ones that really have the power to create change. From our perspective, our goal is to bring people together. And I'll also mention public-private partnerships is another big thing that we do. So because deployments in the AV world are relatively new, I think that, it's going to be, we're going to see some pretty unusual or some new types of partnerships come to play here with the public sector, with private sector, and everything in between to make these types of projects successful. So I'd say that we also might, play a role in that kind of matchmaking, helping to put partnerships together. But a lot of the work that's going to happen will be at the local level.
I would just add, I think it's great to see that this is happening at the local level, given that in my opinion, a lot of the conversation has been driven by the companies who have a business model around autonomous vehicles, right? And so I see it as opportunity to kind of get ahead of that, I would say, domination of the companies that want their business going, right? I think it's good to see and important. And even though our findings note that, maybe this isn't as big of a deal as we think, I think we could make it a bigger deal. I think we could make it be an opportunity rather than just letting it happen and occur to whatever land uses we see fit, right? So.
And to that local question that you all spoke to, Christopher had a question about specific, oops, sorry, no. One person had a specific, I've lost the, oh yeah, it's Christopher. What are the levers that local agencies can really pull to impact AV? So that are really shared versus owned. So there's a land use side we're talking about, but a lot of the implications you all talked through were really dependent on that owned versus shared scenario. And Ian had a similar question related to that shared versus private AVs. Wonder if you all can reflect a little bit on that.
Marissa, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. So I think that, this kind of goes back to what Nico and Robert have been saying before, that there's a ton of different scenarios we can envision, right? And we don't exactly know which one is how things will shake out in the end. But there could be everything from, closed systems of AVs that are shared that operate on the roadway to transformative changes where we no longer need personal garages anymore. Nobody owns their vehicles and everybody can hop in and be a part of a shared Waymo experience. So I think that there's a lot of different ways that this could kind of play out, depending on how the infrastructure goes. I don't know. I'll see if anyone wants to add to
that. I'll say, I feel like some things that can happen at the local level. To me, this is mostly a national level question, a federal government question of if private AVs are allowed. And to me, one of the big questions is going to be the amount of oversight and like safety screening that needs to happen. How that's right now, it's very much a free for all where the federal government has more or less said you can self-certify everywhere. And my sense is that'll change as we start seeing more and more crashes and injuries around these things, and there'll be a need to do more local, more specific policy at the federal level to help shape those things. I do worry that if it turns out that private AVs start to be the direction that we go, that has huge painful consequences for the local level regulation, in that we don't think the culture of the United States is, if you own your own car, you should be able to do more or less anything you want to do with that car, as long as it follows the rules of like driving. And so the idea of saying, well, we should tax empty vehicle miles, or we really want to push shared rides or pooled rides, or these types of things. That regulatory landscape makes sense if we think of them as taxis and as shared modes. As soon as they become individually owned, and that, I think, really limits the types of things that a city can do. In other words, the city of LA has a lot of regulations for its taxis, and we all accept that and understand that, and actually it's really helpful to have those things. It does not have that same leeway to make those kind of regulations for privately owned vehicles. So the two points to what I'm saying is, on the one hand, I think a lot of that has to happen at the federal level, and on the second hand, we should be the second point is that we should be worried about if it does move to privately owned AVs. I think that's going to have a really limiting effect on what kinds of things we can do at the local level.
Yeah, Nico, I remember early on in this project, we were talking about, like, okay, well, we see these impacts for shared. Are we going to see them for private ownership? And we were kind of a little chuckling, like, wait, nothing would likely happen with private ownership other than higher vehicle miles traveled, and maybe people living further away. Like, it would be more of the same kind of trends that we've seen from, suburbanization onward.
Yeah, it would be very much the, I think, type of development we see right now, just more painful with a lot more congestion.
So I'm going to combine some questions from John and Skip in questions of thinking about technology that moves fast and government that moves often not so fast. And so both of their questions focus on thinking about these technologies that move quickly and thinking about shared micromobility experiences when a lot of, say, scooters were dropped in city streets. The public are often very reactive. So can you all talk a little bit about, is there a move now with AVs and thinking about how to get ahead of the technology and be proactive? And could some of that potentially include things like flexible zoning tools, maybe like an overlay zoning for emerging mobility, and thinking how to adapt to a technology that's coming potentially quickly, but also hasn't a certain future?
Who wants to take that one first?
Just a couple of quick thoughts on my end. I will say that, for better or for worse, I think we're being forced to proactively think about AVs. When I think about micromobility and, scooters hitting the scene, and there's absolutely, I'm sure, lots of thoughts to be had there. That was a lot more, I don't know, they don't require the same level of supportive infrastructure and the same level of, I don't know, participation from other parties and key players. I feel like because AV is such a complex thing and because it requires so much more of that supportive infrastructure, we're, for better or worse, forced to proactively think about these things. So, you know, a lot of governments are right now here in the same place together, wondering how are we going to better adopt and prepare ourselves for it. And that's where it really comes back to this AV readiness and thinking about that and how it fits into the current context of things. So I think that we are being proactive about it, and governments are trying to move as quickly as they can.
Yeah,
and I would say,
go ahead, Robert. Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I would say in the California context, there's actually already precedent of a mobility related overlay with Senate Bill 79. It's the transit oriented development bill that was signed into law, I think last year now. And that kind of shows us that there are these opportunities that we can plan our land uses around mobility again, like we used to do.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, on the one hand, I think so broadly, I've advocated this a ton, piloting like crazy. So this isn't like changes in regulation, but it is changes in knowledge. Like it's like tremendously helpful to pilot, try things out, see what kind of impacts there are, so then you can make better decisions at the local level. And related to that, I think studies. So you know, one of the studies that so for us doing this study was like an important first step in really diving into what the actual impacts are going to be. I think there's a whole nother series of studies. One of them, which I think would be really interesting, is looking more at the depots and how those work, what kind of impacts there are around those. Because in theory, we will have a lot more of those. If this goes to scale, we'll have a lot more of those. So, you know, doing the research, doing the piloting, I think that's really important to give local jurisdictions the knowledge they need to be able to figure out what kinds of things to do. In terms of actual regulation, I would say the overlay zones I think are a fantastic idea. I'd say the other thing is one of the, I don't know if this is a tool, it's more of like an approach. You just have to set up the expectation that your regulations are first passes. We're going to do this regulation, and with the time frame that in a year, in 2 years, this is what happened with scooter regulations, which I think were so helpful in cities. This is a quick-moving world, and we're going to put these regulations in place, and we're going to let everyone know and set the expectation that we're going to review these in a year and come back with updated ones. On the one hand, it's not ideal because no one likes things that shift. But on the other hand, there's too many unknowns to make decisions that have foresight that is impossible to have right now. So really, it's not like regulation language, but it is expectation and culture of we're doing this right now. And I would very much look at micromobility, like scooters specifically and bikes, on how it is that culture was kind of set up. I think that's a really good thing. And then the last thing I'll say is, the technology is evolving quickly, but it's not like tomorrow, right? I mean, like these things, right? So, I mean, we just, did this quick back of the envelope analysis of, the number of trips right now that are being used by Waymo are 0.006% of all trips in the US, right? If you triple that, you're at the mode share for skateboards. We are not doing, a ton of regulatory gymnastics for skateboards right now. Granted, yes, this will grow. I'm not saying it won't grow, but it's not happening tomorrow. And as we mentioned with this research specifically, even if I was to snap my fingers and have AVs everywhere in the entire country right now, it would be a while before the land use adapted to that. And it's not just that the regulations seem to adapt, but there's a lot of individual decisions that property owners need to make a shift from oh, this was a parking lot and now I'm going to make development happen here. So yes, we need to be looking at it. Yes, absolutely, we need to figure out the readiness, but also our hair's not on fire.
So the title of the webinar probably should have been "Shifting Spaces?" rather than "Shifting Spaces:" right?
Good.
Okay, I have a final quick question, maybe, which is just speaking of this idea of land use is shifting, right? And this question of that change. Barbara asks, and there's a very concrete example from Santa Monica, that there's a Waymo hub adjacent to a residential neighborhood. The site was repurposed from a previously auto-oriented use, and staff received frequent 311 submissions related to noise, blocked alley access, etc. So can you all talk if there was anything you encountered in your research kind of speaking to this transition, especially from even one auto-oriented land use to one that serves AVs, and just the implications for kind of that friction that the real world often brings?
Robert, I think you've got the most experience with this in terms of you and I, because you've seen these things.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll take you back to a time when I was grabbing a bagel in central LA, and I looked across the street, and it was an old CBS. It was the old CBS studio, CBS Center, or whatever it was. And there was this empty parking lot, and I realized that all of it is covered. They're covered with parked Waymos and chargers. And I'm like, wow, there's a cheap. They did get some cheap land maybe there for a moment. But I agree that, like, we've seen videos of, for example, I'm sure a lot of us have seen the video in San Francisco of all the Waymos like beeping at each other to get out of the way in its own parking lot, right? And so I think that's such an interesting question, and one that, I think it's along the same lines of, like, these are policy choices that we can make. And I think, like, if we're talking about zoning, well, zoning came in to vogue because we were trying to separate things because of these types of nuances. And I'm not pushing for more Euclidean zoning, but I am saying that maybe there are opportunities where we can regulate that and be a little bit more clear about where we're placing these. And one of the frictions of that is that Waymo is, for example, Waymo, among other companies, is locating themselves where there's consumer demand, rather than locating themselves in a logistics park where there isn't any residential. And so there's already a friction that we see. And so I think the question, I don't think I'm fully answering the question, but I think the question's a good one that we probably should move forward with. Yeah.
And that's exactly the kind of research that I was saying is important for us to there are some places, there's not a ton, but there are some places where these depots already exist. Let's do more research on where those places are, what locations are being selected, how well they're working for the AV companies, what are the impacts of these things, both direct impacts and indirect impacts, what's positive, what's negative. Those are all good things for us to be doing right now, so that we're ready as when it does end up expanding.
And I can quickly round this out too. I'll just add that I think it's a great idea for us to take a look and see what transit operators are doing. They've already been pushing through in this transition to EV. And a lot of that comes with retrofitting, warehouses and depots and things like that. So we can look to them to see how things are operating. And then between that and using zoning and, a couple of other policy mechanisms, I think it's a good question that we should, work on finding an answer to.
Great. Thank you all. With that, I'm going to thank everyone for attending our webinar. Thanks to Marissa, Robert, and Nico for sharing your research and experience. And again, please stay tuned for future Urbanism Next webinars, and hope you all have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Please do check out the report from the link. It's on our website, Urbanism Next. And love to hear from you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.